thank you for coming. I'm Doug Reed. I'm director of the Master's Program in Educational Transformation here at Georgetown, also in the government department. I just want to thank you all for coming to our Excellence in Identity in Education Transforming Practice and Policy speaker series. This is our first event, obviously, for this semester. We've got 2 other speakers coming this semester, so be on the lookout for those. For those of you who don't know, the master's program we launched just about a year and a half ago in July of 2017, and our mission, the way we see our mission, is to equip professionals to undertake the necessary work of transforming education, to pay attention to deeply rooted issues of race and class in American education, and to understand the levers of change that exist within the educational universe, and to strategize and think about ways to challenge the existing inequities within our system. We have 2 concentrations, one in advocacy and policy for folks who want to go into nonprofit sector or district level work, and then a new concentration we just launched this past July in learning and teaching, which is Georgetown's first teacher preparation program. So, and we're still accepting applications for both of those for next year, and we have generous financial aid packages available for that. So there are flyers for that up front, and so if anyone wants to know more about it, please come up and talk to me afterwards. I want to thank Krista Stevens for arranging the speaker series. She is on leave this semester, but she's with us in spirit because she's been instrumental in coordinating all of this. So the speakers you hear today are in many ways her vision for what the speaker series could look like. And I want to thank Krista Plopp for coordinating all the logistics for all of this. Dr. Sabrina Wesley-Nero, who is also one of our core faculty members, is unable to be here today, or she'll be coming a little bit later, I think. But she directs a program that we founded in 2012 called Education, Inquiry, and Justice. And for undergraduates who are in their first or second year, it's a minor within the college that has a lot of the similar motivations and ambitions of the master's program, treating issues about equity, but also thinking about education within as an object of study within the liberal arts. And so that minor is by application, and the application deadline is coming up in February. So if any folks who are undergrads want to apply for that, we have flyers for that up here as well. So we're very excited today to have Dr. Bree Picower and Dr. Paul Gorski here presenting, and my job is to really get out of the way at this point. But I just do want to say a couple of words about their work and the background. Dr. Picower is a professor at Montclair State University and is an author, a widely published author in multiple venues and media. Her book, Practice What You Teach, Social Justice in the Classroom and the Streets, is an important and landmark book. And so we're very happy to have her here today. Dr. Paul Gorski is formerly at George Mason University, but he's now at EdChange. He's the founder of EdChange, which is an educational consulting group that works with schools directly in addressing issues about equity and race and class. And he's the author as well of multiple books ranging from Voices for Equity and Social Justice, a literary education anthology, to more recent works with his colleagues at EdChange. So we're very excited to have them here, and we're going to have Dr. Picower go first, and then we'll have Dr. Gorski, and then we'll hold questions for the end, so we can sort of get an exchange between the 2 of them going. So thank you for coming, and
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hey, I've been on the road since 6 o'clock this morning. I've had a lot of coffee.
Yes.
So this 45-minute talk might be done at 20. Just warning you, Paul, you might be out soon. Okay, so I'm here today to talk about some of the work that I do. The work that I do is situated in teacher education. I direct 2 teacher education programs that are focused on social and racial justice in New Jersey and prepare teachers to teach in Newark, New Jersey. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about curriculum and teachers' understandings about race and the relationship between the two. So my talk today is called Curriculum So White. I'll talk a little bit about where that hashtag comes from. And I'm going to be sharing with you today in the talk and also in the workshop a little bit from a collection that I have. So I have several collections, like many of you, I'm sure. I collect cheetah print clothing. I seem to have like a lot of cheetah print, leopard print clothing. I collect little rescue dogs. This is my latest. I got him last week. Oh, he's so cute. And I somehow seem to collect racist curriculum. So I started talking about curriculum and race a long time ago, and it's one of those things, you know, when you collect things, people give you things that match your curriculum. So oftentimes people will send me things that they've seen, like, oh, Bree, I saw the most racist thing, I thought of you. Thank you. So this collection, unfortunately, has been growing quite a bit in the last few years as we have seen more and more examples, such as this one, that have been going viral over social media. So this is from a textbook in Texas that that gained attention when a mother saw this textbook that her son was using, and kind of sparked a social media campaign around the way in which the Middle Passage and slavery was referred to as kind of a workers program, right? And so this was one of the early kind of, you know, as social media, as Facebook became a venue for sharing these examples, we started to see more and more of those. So, you know, as a kind of a trigger warning, I am going to be showing some really disturbing curriculum, but these are things that are in our schools right now. And if the work that you're doing as advocacy and change agents and teachers, you're going to be seeing these things, and these things are in front of children in our schools right now. So to share a few other examples, this is one that is from an elementary school that says, we are excited to start our Native American unit and we need your help. Please help your child come up with a Native American name that fits his or her personality, interests, or special talents. We will be using his or her Native American name on our headdresses and costumes, as well as in our tribes. Some examples from past years are one who loves Barbies, or one who loves Legos, dancing flowers, you know, and it goes on and on. So we see here in this example just a complete denigration of Indigenous culture and the importance of naming within Indigenous culture. And then, you know, we're surprised when we see the Covington High School students denigrating Indigenous elders, right? When this is literally what we're teaching in elementary schools, to not have respect for people's culture. And we can see what that leads to when we, you know, when things like what this weekend happen. So, you know, for things like this, we have ones where we might be able to talk about, you know, the teacher's intention and what they intended from this. And then we have other ones where the teacher's intentions are just truly questionable. This is a math teacher, a math middle school teacher. Paul, can you read any one of those questions for us?
Number 3 says Dwayne pimps 3 hoes. If the price is $85 per trick, how many tricks per day must each hoe turn to support Dwayne's $800 per day crack habit?
So this is real. This is a real math lesson that was taught. And as in most of these examples, it's parents who are bringing this to our attention. So sometimes it's very blatant, examples such as this, and sometimes it's more subtle. and happening from preschool to high school, right? We can see these examples. This is another one from New Jersey, where the assignment itself was to examine the ugly and foundational role that slavery played in colonial America, which that's a great question, right? That's a great question for students to examine. But what happens is that all of these kind of questions, or this might be a social studies standard, gets translated through teachers' understandings about race, and resulted in this was some of the student work that came out of this project that lined the hallway of the school, that also came to parents' attention, who then were up in arms about this. Because why is this an issue? What's happening here?
They're criminalizing people of color.
Okay. What else? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is not a discussion. This is just replicating the things of the past without any kind of meaningful insight discussion about how it's harmful.
Right, and we don't know what happened inside the classroom, but we do know that these were lining the bulletin boards in the hallway. So students who are walking by also have no idea what happened in the classroom that might have led to this. Who are students being asked to identify with by making posters like this? Slave owners, right? So when we're asking students and students of color to create these, we're asking them to identify with white oppressors, right? That's not a holistic perspective of history that really gets at the question of the ugly and foundational role that slavery played in colonial America. So a lot of this is what happens when curriculum meets an individual teacher, and what are teachers' understandings about race that then gets put into curriculum. So this was an assignment that Jerome was asked to do, and the question was, give 3 good reasons for slavery and 3 bad reasons. Make notes and then put them in complete sentences on a separate sheet of paper for presenting all arguments. Okay. So could someone tell us Jerome's response?
I feel there is no good reason for slavery. That's why I did not write.
Bad reasons included biting them, splitting them up from family members, making them do your chores and work when it's your job to do that, and punishing them. And I am proud to be Black because we are strong and brave. So we see Jerome looking for any, he knows what he knows, right? And he's looking for the cracks and the fissures in this assignment for his voice to be heard. Not all students have Jerome's strength and voice to make that happen. We also see a similar kind of clapback from King Johnson. Can someone read King Johnson's response, his journal entry for us?
Today was not a good learning day. Blah, blah, blah. Only wanted to hear you not talking. You said nothing, and I'm sorry, I can't read that.
You said something
You said
wrong.
something wrong, and I can't listen when I hear lies. My mom said that the only Christopher
Mm-hmm.
is he acknowledged is Wallace.
So this was a Christopher Columbus
Yes,
lesson,
Columbus.
so that's what he
Because
said.
Columbus can't find our country. Didn't find our country. The Indians did. I like to have Columbus Day off out, but I want. Yeah, sorry, I can't read it.
That's okay. You're getting help. It's a group effort. Keep going.
But I want you
I like-
to know.
I like to have Columbus Day off, but I want you to not teach the lies. That is all.
My question for the day is, how can white people teach Black history?
Right? And then the king, I am very disappointed in your journal
I
today.
love it.
And his response? Okay, fine, right? Okay, so we love this, right? We love when the students have the opportunity to speak back to this. But the point I want to make is that it's not Black children's responsibility to be the Black Twitter of curriculum, right? That's teachers' job and that's teacher education's job. It's not children's job to be sure that they're not getting this kind of curriculum put in front of them. So what I want to talk about today is how, where this kind of what I'm calling white supremacist curriculum lives, and how it came to be. Because it's tempting to think that it's just these individual teachers who have racist ideas and are putting forth this curriculum. But really what it is that it's situated in the permanence of racism in education. And I get the sense from the description of your program that these are issues that you're really exploring. And so thinking about the connections between some of the deep-rooted issues around race that have been part of the curriculum that you're learning, and where we can see those as antecedents to some of the curriculum that I just shared with you. Teacher demographics, which we'll get into, also play a role in where we see this kind of curriculum being so prevalent. And again, teachers' understanding, teachers' ideology about race is also shaping what they end up teaching. So, you know, this was happening way before the current administrative, you know, the administration that we have in power right now. This isn't as a result of the power structure that we have right now. This comes out of a long history of race and racism and its relationship to teaching. So in terms of the teacher demographics, we have an 82% white teaching force. Students in higher educations enrolled in teacher prep programs were 74% white. So we don't see a huge shift coming along at this point to transform those demographics. And they're being prepared by a teacher education profession that, like myself, is 88% white. I always do this. I'm not 88% white. I'm 100% white, but the teaching force is 88% white. So I also want to say at this point that I don't believe that, you know, as I'm laying this out, it's not that white teachers are not capable of teaching from an anti-racist social justice perspective, but it does take special preparation and unlearning and examination of the way in which we were socialized to understand race. And most teacher education programs are not engaging in that work. And so the teacher demographics does become an issue when that race is, when their understandings about race are unexamined. So that leads to responsibilities that teacher education has. So as somebody who's in teacher education, there are things that we can be doing to address some of the understandings that teachers bring to us before they get into the field. So supporting teachers to understand their own racial identity and how that shapes their ideology, and that's what I'm going to focus in on a little bit more today. Preparing teacher candidates to understand students, so understanding yourself, understanding who your students are and their racial identity, preparing teachers to teach from a multicultural or culturally relevant perspective, preparing teachers to address racial inequity in broader issues than just like looking at who is being sent to special ed, who is being disproportionately disciplined, school to prison pipeline, like playing a role in all of that. Supporting teachers of color to navigate racism and hostile racial climates within schools, and diversifying the teaching force. So all of these are responsibilities that teacher education can play in shifting multiple things that then lead to that kind of curriculum. Because often, and I think Dr. Gorski's talk is going to talk a little bit more about some of these and how some of them attempt to do this work and how some of them say they're doing this work, but may not actually be creating the changes that would shift what we're seeing in curriculum. Because oftentimes when I see these examples, the first thing I think is, where did you get your teacher education certification from? Like, how was none of this addressed within that? And oftentimes it's because curriculum is really the tip of the iceberg of what we see from a teacher, right? We can see their lesson plans, we can see the student work that we just looked at, but what it really leaves unrevealed is everything below there, which is teachers' racial ideology, right? And so oftentimes within teacher education programs, what we're doing is helping you to learn how to lesson plan, helping you to learn how to unit plan, helping you to understand the content that you're teaching in terms of math or social studies or ELA. But all of that is just what we can see, and it's not getting underneath what is going to kind of shift and interfere with what you end up teaching as educators. So I'm going to share a little bit from a study that I've been kind of slowly working on and collecting data for probably about 15 years of looking at teachers' understandings about race and their racial ideology, and also looking at the curriculum that they ultimately end up teaching. So I'm going to share examples from 3 teachers looking at the way that they think about race, and then looking at how they're thinking about teaching, so that we can see that connection, that there is a connection there between the two. So we're gonna look at Dawn, Sarah, and Casey, and look at both that underside of the iceberg and the iceberg. So we'll start with Dawn and her understandings about race. So Dawn said, like, maybe I'm almost being a little bit racist, because you just want to say sometimes, get over it. Like, get over it. Move on. So what, you're black? So what, I'm white? If I get better grades in school, maybe I worked harder. If I get a job, maybe I deserved it. Why does it always have to be like, well, they're the minority, let's give it to them? I'm done with that. It's time to start a new life. Okay, so this was in response to talking about affirmative action. And, this was kind of her understanding that we have this equal meritocratic playing field, and that any hint that there might actually be inequality is problematic, right? And that was sort of her very passionate response to that. So we can see that she has understandings about race that are really rooted in an understanding that racism is a thing of the past, that racism is over, and it's just time to move on and get over it, get past it. So she has this hegemonic underside. She is keeping these ideas about race in place as a way to justify some of the understandings that she has. So with this underneath the iceberg, what is the curriculum that she's going to teach look like, right? So in talking about what she wants to teach, she said, how can I teach the past and not focus on all the bad things and just focus on things that are happening now? As if what's happening now is all good things? Okay, but aside. A lot of the books, it's about white and white did this to the blacks. So I'm trying to figure out ways to stop that so much and to say, well, whites did good for the blacks and the blacks did good for the whites. Not that whites did bad, whites did bad, whites did bad, right? So you can see a link here between her understanding that racism is over, racism is a thing of the past, to what is she then going to teach her second graders when it's MLK Day, right? What is she going to teach them about what happened in Covington? Like, is she going to teach them about that? What is she going to teach them about Native Americans and the genocide that happened to Native Americans? She's not going to teach them anything besides the Santa Maria, the Pinta, whatever the 3 ships are, right? That's going to be the Columbus story that her students get, because she doesn't want to teach about the bad things of the past. So we can see this direct link between what she understands about race, how that influences her curriculum, and how she's going to transmit her understandings about race through what she teaches to her students, ultimately keeping racism in place, right? So that's sort of the link I want you to think about, is what is the teacher's understanding? How do you see that in the curriculum? And how does that then function to maintain racism? So we see for her that it leads to this ahistorical white apologist curriculum. All right. So now we're going to move to another student, Sarah, who she's going to share a little bit about how she grew up. She said, I lived in predominantly white middle-class neighborhood, which was only made up of about 14,000 people. It was a very small town where everybody knew everybody. The schools were made up of predominantly white students with your occasional Black, Latino, Asian, and Middle Eastern student thrown in there. My town was very much the opposite of a diverse community. So Sarah went into the teacher program that was preparing her to teach in Newark and was introduced to diversity for the first time through this. And unlike Dawn's response that was very kind of resistant to it, for Sarah, it was like, oh my God, there's this whole world that I hadn't been exposed to. She said, I wasn't taught to look at skin color. I was taught that we were all the same. I like to believe that I was raised open-mindedly, but now I wonder if I was raised naively. Perhaps never understanding true diversity or celebrating cultural differences was a bad thing. So we see like cracks here, a little bit more open-mindedness, some questioning of how she was raised. But she grew up in this, kind of segregated community and became excited about the diversity that was being presented to her, and it was kind of an awakening for her. So in thinking about what she wanted to teach, she said, I'm aware of the various cultures, ethnicities, and races that surround me, and I couldn't be happier with where I've ended up or more excited to begin this journey in getting to meet many different people from a million different walks of life. I like to believe that I have seen enough to understand that being different is inevitable, yet it's a beautiful thing. So she's kind of moved away from this color blindness to excitement around diversity. And so in teaching her second graders, she decided that she, wanted to teach about diversity. So she kind of talked about where you might see diversity with them. This is an anchor chart from her classroom. And then she had them start to examine her classroom library to see whether or not the books that the students were exposed to were representative of who her students were. So she started engaging her students in a more critical examination of their library. So they looked at this book, Enemy Pie, to see if it was diverse. It was not. They thought about who they saw and who they didn't see in that book. And then they started doing this with all of their books. So then they looked at a book called All Families Are Special. And they saw a lot of different kinds of people in that book. So then integrating math into their curriculum, they went through their entire classroom library, collected data and did observations of 266 books, and they found that their library was not diverse. And they she really built this into her math curriculum, doing data analysis, and they charted who was represented in terms of race in their books, who was represented in terms of gender in their books, and who was represented in terms of disabilities in their book. So then they decided to take action on this. They wrote a letter to their PTA saying that they had a problem with their classroom library and that they needed more diversity within their classroom library and how important it was. And the PTA was on board and started to provide them with, they allowed the students to pick some titles that they would want in their classroom library, and they did a fundraiser to make that happen. So this is a much more uplifting story where we look at someone who, even though they grew up in a very white segregated town and had been raised not to talk about race, not to notice race, that through reflection and open-mindedness, she was able to move past her segregated underside to build multicultural curriculum. But in some ways, it was still kind of a very nice, very safe, multi-culti, kumbaya kind of curriculum, where she wasn't really asking, well, why? Why do we see this discrepancy in who we see? Okay, we see this and let's fix it, but there's no sort of questioning of racism, of sexism, of ableism, in how it might have ended up that the students had the libraries that they have. So there is something around, and I think I'm thinking that Paul's going to get more into just the idea of diversity as an end-all, be-all, as a social justice strategy, and that just representation doesn't shift power structures. So then the last example is from a student named Casey, who was teaching in Newark at the time that it became publicly known that there was lead in the water in many of the public schools in Newark. It had been known privately for quite a bit of time before the schools and the public knew that there was lead in the water in the schools. And so these are some reflections from Casey's journal as this was happening. She said, "Perhaps I didn't think that something like this could possibly happen at a place where I'm teaching. I grew up in a rich white town. My mom woke me up daily and made me breakfast. We sat on the front porch together while I waited for my bus. I never had to worry about my well-being in any aspect. Now I'm in a school where these are not the realities." So we hear, Casey talking about this more privileged upbringing that she had. And she shared, as this was happening, the school that she was teaching at was not on the list of the schools that had lead. But she still said, "As I cautiously brought bottled water to school, I let each and every child who comes in huffing and puffing from recess rush to the water fountain. The students look to me for guidance, and I feel in this situation I have failed. I'm focused on my thought process. I'm asking myself why. Things were so much easier before I learned about privilege and racism. Sometimes I feel like my awareness is really powerful and I am making little changes here and there, but then I cannot find the answers as to why the water at school was not good enough for me to drink, but it was fine for the kids. What will I say when a student asks me about this after they've been drinking the water this whole time we've been learning about the crisis? They trust me. What do I do?" So even though her school wasn't on the list and never ended up on the list, she still wasn't drinking that water herself and was having this nagging feeling like, I'm realizing that my actions, not just what I teach, but my actions every day are part of this issue. So that led her to really question, as you can see here. And I think that it's this kind of questioning, this kind of reflectiveness that lays the groundwork for social justice teaching, right? That being a reflective, we talk in education about being a reflective practitioner, but in my experience now, it's the teachers that are able to reflect on their practice, even when they mess up teaching a social justice unit. If they can reflect upon it, they can think about it, they can change. But without that ability to receive feedback or to open your mind to any sort of accountability, that's where we see more of the hegemonic understandings. So Casey ended up deciding to teach about the water crisis, to not let it just be something that was happening in the news, but to bring it into her classroom. So she came up with enduring understandings for her unit. She wanted her students to understand that as humans, they are entitled to certain rights and access to resources, that with the power of knowledge, they're able to use their voices to create change in their communities. She wanted them to understand that the quality of resources and infrastructure may differ from one community to the next, resulting in disparities and unequal access to resources. So you start to see she's getting into questioning power here in a way that we didn't necessarily see with Sarah. So she had her students do inquiry into what they knew, what they wanted to know about the water crisis, basic teaching at KWL, what they wanted to know, what they learned through this process. They asked questions about who was affected, who was in charge, and what ultimately the students ended up doing was that she wanted them to decide what action they wanted to take. they felt like they were finding a lot of information for adults about what was happening, but there wasn't kid-friendly information. So they decided to create posters and brochures for other students in their school about the water crisis, and about what was happening in other schools. And they went from class to class presenting their findings about what they had learned through this inquiry, and integrated a lot of science into this unit as well. You can see how this would lead to a lot of science inquiry. So Casey, even though she had this privileged underside, she examined it, and through that was able to move towards teaching social justice curriculum. So again, to just think about what is happening that would lead from this one area to the next, from the underside to the curriculum. In Dawn, we see her resisting and maintaining her understandings about race, and therefore not really being able to move to anything but an oppressive curriculum. With Sarah, we see she was kind of apolitical but open-minded, and that led to a more multicultural curriculum where we're looking at differences but not really asking how differences affect equality, equity, how differences impact our lives in different ways. And then Casey was able to move by really being reflective and asking questions, which is, I think, a key skill in social justice teaching. So I'm just going to move to a couple of strategies that I think teacher education can really think about. And I think it's important that and I think your program is one that allows for this kind of thinking, to move away from sort of tinkering with teacher education, with this class here, with this class here, but really thinking, how does this whole project need to change in order to provide educators who can interrupt the kind of curriculum and interrupt the kind of problematic ways that race plays out to maintain white supremacy through the education system. And so one of those is gatekeeping who becomes teachers. This one is very raw for me right now because we actually had to dismiss a student for this reason yesterday from our program, despite all of the work that we were trying to do to help her with her racial ideology and the way that she was teaching about race. It just, it didn't go the way we had hoped that it would go. And again, it was that lack of reflectiveness and accountability that we had to make the hard decision of, do we think that she should be teaching in front of the Black and Latino students in her school that she's at in Newark right now? Like, is that who these students deserve? And ultimately, as teacher educators, that's who we have to be responsible to. It's tempting because she, in many ways, is a lovely young woman who I care about, and we all grew to love and care about. But that's not who we as teacher educators need to be accountable to. We need to be accountable to the children and the families that she's going to be sitting in front of. And sometimes that means making tough decisions about who should be teachers. So a lot of that work can happen at admissions, and it doesn't happen at admissions often because teacher education is often what they call the cash cow for schools of education. It's where we get a lot of money. So sometimes I talk about the admission at my school as being like, you have a pulse and a bank account, we'll take you, right? And we need to move away from that to really think about, are the teacher candidates who are applying into our program, do they have some level of justice mindedness? And we've developed some strategies on how we can start to identify that. Do you need to be like a social justice warrior from day one coming into the program? No, that's not where everybody is, right? But do you need to have some way of demonstrating that you have an assets view instead of a deficit view of urban communities? That's something we can listen for, right? Because we only have a year to a year and a half with our teacher education candidates. There's only so much that we can get done on top of the important work of learning how to lesson plan, classroom management, all of these other things. how much interrupting can we do in that time period? So some of those initial ways of being justice-minded need to be present to come into these programs, in my opinion. So that's a big one. And another one is, how do we address teachers' racial ideology through the work that we do in teacher education, so that it's not just learning methods, learning content, but how do we help teachers to examine who we are, how we were socialized, and how we can move past the socialization that all of us, white teachers and teachers of color, have received about race, and how that might show up in the teaching that we do. And so that needs to be the work. And I would argue that is curriculum development. In your curriculum design class, this is what you should be doing, because it impacts what you're teaching. And then in my workshop later on, we're going to talk more as the individuals that we are. When we see this happening, how can we fine tune some strategies on how we as individuals might be able to interrupt some of this, because we've all probably seen things. I imagine some of you are parents, you've seen it in your children's curriculum, you've seen it in a school that you were visiting, you've seen the children making Native American headdresses for Thanksgiving, right? When we see this, how can we strengthen our muscles of learning how to interrupt some of it? So I'm going to stop there, turn it over to Dr. Gorski.
Okay, how's it going?
Good.
That was a pretty awesome presentation, wasn't it? Yes. Feel all self-conscious following that, but we'll do my best. So, actually our talks are actually overlap in some interesting ways. My work, for a long time, like 15 years, I was a teacher educator. My work now is mostly working directly with schools and school districts. I'm often the person that comes in when a district has kind of done the celebrating diversity thing and the cultural competence thing and the other sort of diversity light sorts of things, and they think they're ready to move to something else. And so a lot of my work is trying to bridge schools and school districts and leaders of schools and school districts to a more transformative way of thinking about equity and thinking about justice. I use this framework called equity literacy that I'll talk about in a second. But I want to start with this, just a question that might not seem completely relevant, but I promise it's kind of relevant, at least. So how many of you have spent any time reading about, talking about, or learning about learning styles? Raise your hand if you've done any of that. Okay, many of you have some learning styles background. Do any of you know what happened when researchers started looking into the idea of learning styles? Somebody here know?
A lot of mixed results, but by and large, they didn't find that learning styles were kind of what we're told that they are, right? It does appear that different kinds of presentations might matter according to the discipline. So for instance, visual is important for doing geometry, but in terms of people have definite preferences, but whether or not they learn the material just because they're taught in the style that they prefer, it doesn't actually equate with greater learning outcomes.
Yeah, so there've sort of been two phases of research about learning styles. The first phase, basically what they found is that, which contradicts what I learned when I was in an education program myself. So the first bit of research, what they found was it is not effective to teach two learning styles. So this whole model, identify the learning style, teach to the learning style, what they found was it basically has no impact. And the reason it's got no impact is nobody has a static learning style, because learning styles morph depending on what they're learning and sort of connects with what you were saying, from whom they're learning, whether they trust the person they're learning from, and all those sorts of things. And then researchers were curious about, well, why doesn't it work? Because it seems like it ought to work. It seems like it would make sense as a strategy. That run of research, basically what they found is there's really no such thing as learning styles. Someone basically just made that up. Someone basically made that up, and then suddenly everyone, when I first got started in this work, a lot of the conversation about diversity was based around learning styles. Here's what I learned. Here's the African American learning style. Here's the Asian American Pacific Islander learning style. Now, I always thought, raise your hand if you've ever seen the continent of Asia on a map or a globe. Any of you? So if you've seen that, doesn't it seem kind of ridiculous to think that all I need to know is that someone's ancestors come from somewhere on that continent, and I can make any presumption about their learning style or their communication style? That was the diversity education I had when I was in school. And are any of you have counseling or psychology backgrounds? A lot of the textbooks, the multicultural counseling textbooks, are set up like that. Here's how you counsel African American people. Here's how you counsel gay people. Here's how you counsel low-income people. And it's all just terribly bogus. Now, the reason why I start with this, and I should not be going on and on because I only have 45 minutes, but the reason I start with this is I think one of the biggest problems in education right now is that we're obsessed with shiny new initiatives. So if there's a problem, so let's throw grit at that and see what happens. Let's throw growth mindset at that. Let's throw mindfulness, social emotional learning, PBIS. Let's throw, and when we're talking, and this is especially true when we're talking about educational disparities and inequities. Oh, there's a racial gap. Let's throw trauma-informed practices at that and see what happens. And we throw everything at it other than identify how racism is operating, eliminate the racism. That's how you actually close I'm talking about from an institutional level, that's how you close the disparities. I have yet to work with one school whose primary strategy for eliminating inequities is actually eliminating the inequities. It's almost like, I even think of a higher ed example, like the colleges and universities when it comes to diversity and inclusion always seem to be obsessed with recruitment and retention, recruit and retain. Recruit faculty of color, students of color, retain. Now, the best way to retain faculty and students of color is to eliminate the racism they experience when they're on campus. But I don't know of a single campus they do everything else. We do a mentor program so that other people of color can do uncompensated surface work, mentoring other, commiserating with other people of color about how they're all experiencing racism. But rarely it's like, what we really need to do is eliminate the racism. So the work that I do with schools is largely about helping them shift there, identify the inequity, eliminate the inequity. Again, I'm working sort of like at the institutional level, the building level, the district level. And so this is what I want to talk to you. I'm really bad at coming up with agendas, but this is sort of what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so I want to start with a little quiz, and this is just a little warm up to sort of exercise those equity literacy muscles. And so let's see how you do on the quiz. Let's start with this. A majority of people experiencing poverty in the U.S. live in, how many of you would guess urban areas? How many of you would guess urban areas? Nobody? How many of you would guess suburban areas? How many of you would guess rural areas? It is rural areas. Where do you think the fastest growing poverty is? Suburban areas. And a big part of the reason for that is actually gentrification in urban areas. I always want to take this question off the quiz because for some reason I can never pronounce the word rural. Rural. Everyone say rural.
Rural. It is
Yeah, you can't pronounce it either, so at some point we need a different word for that. According to a national study of U.S. parents, 66% of parents from families not experiencing poverty reported they always checked to ensure their children did their homework. What percentage of parents from families that are experiencing poverty reported they always checked to ensure their children did their homework? Raise your hand if you would guess. 42%, 72%, 92%. The correct answer is 72%. Now, when I go into schools and school districts and I use this question, I would say about 2/3 of teachers pick 42% for that. I'm not into shaming them. There's no particular reason you would know this statistic, but I do think it's an important baseline for me to reflect about how did I end up with a perception, and it's just a perception, but how did I end up with a perception that's so far off of the reality? And I feel like a lot of my work is about helping educators and educational leaders interpret the things that are happening around them differently, interpret data differently, whether that's like whatever kind of data it is. Because what happens is people notice, well, lower income parents are less likely to visit the school. And then if I'm interpreting that as, well, they must not care about their kids' education, it's really easy to presume they're not doing anything at home. But all the research shows, first of all, that no one's ever done research about who values education and found any difference between any group, whether that's across race, across home language, across socioeconomic status, but the perceptions there. Okay, a Princeton study of elite universities found that legacy applicants, usually white and wealthy, are far more privileged by legacy status than applicants of color are by affirmative action policy. Affirmative action policies. The study determined legacy status was equivalent to how much of a boost to an applicant's SAT score. How many of you would say a 20-point boost? 90-point boost? 160-point boost? Man, y'all are cynical. Well, you happen to be right. Okay. We have deluded ourselves into believing, okay, so who said this? We have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifices. Capitalism was built on the exploitation of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. Who thinks Bernie Sanders said that? Who thinks Michael Moore said that? Who thinks Martin Luther King Jr. said that? Martin Luther King Jr. did say that. Now let me ask you a question. If I walk into any school in Washington, D.C., or anywhere in this country, and I find the Martin Luther King Jr. poster, because it is almost February after all, that's social justice humor for you. What is that poster going to say on it?
I have a dream.
Why is it going to say I have a dream? Why has like the fluffiest thing he ever said, even the fluffiest thing he said in that speech, how did that become his legacy? Why does that happen? Because it's the fluffiest thing? Anybody want to be more specific?
It's not like threatening to anybody in charge of, it's not resistant.
It's not resistant. Who is it not threatening to in particular? Yeah, we have to name that. The reason why I like using this on this quiz is because to me this captures one of the big problems with the ways that most schools and districts do equity work, which is actually prioritizing the comfort, if we're talking about race in particular, doing it at a pace that prioritizes the comfort of white people over actual progress toward racial justice. And when people have gone in and looked at how conversations about race happen in schools, usually what they find is that usually they're really sort of built around attending to the feelings of white people having a hard time talking about race than actual progress toward racial justice. I just wrote an article about this that hopefully the magazine will run. I'm afraid they're going to say it's a little too harsh, but part of the evidence I see of this is that in most schools I work with, it's actually harder to be outspoken about racism. It's harder to be that person than it is to be someone who's perpetuating racism. It's actually easier in most schools to perpetuate homophobia and heterosexism than to actually stand up against homophobia and heterosexism. That's sort of where, and that's even in schools that think they're doing diversity sort of things, right? And those are the sorts of things I saw. It's like, man, we need to talk about this a little different way. Okay. This whole quiz is supposed to take like a minute, but I always have these little commentaries. I can't help it. The 3 richest people in the world have as much wealth as, how many of you would say the 3 richest people have as much wealth as the 8 poorest countries? How many of you would say the 48 poorest countries? How many of you would say the 308 poorest countries? It is the 48 poorest countries. Now, if you said the 308 poorest countries, I hope you're not going to be teaching geography. Because there are 196 countries, actually, in this world. And now we know what's wrong with public education. Okay. All right, so I mentioned, so no particular reason you would know the answers to any of these questions. We're just warming up those equity literacy muscles. So I use this framework that I call equity literacy, and I use language in it that to me is really about infusing a sense of urgency into the conversation. I base the equity literacy framework around these 2 questions. The first one is, what do I, as an educator or educational leader, need? What are the knowledge and skills I need so that I can be a threat to the existence of inequity within my sphere of influence? What are the knowledge and skills I need so when I walk into this classroom, or I walk into this school building, or this district office, or this university campus, what are the knowledge and skills I need so my presence there is a threat to the existence of racism, because I can spot it and I'm willing to do something about it. I'm willing to say something about it. Now notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying what are the knowledge and skills I need to be culturally competent. Cultural competence is wonderful if you got it, but cultural competence does not prepare you to identify and eliminate racism, right? So we need something more than that. It's not that I have the knowledge and skills to celebrate diversity, nothing wrong with celebrating diversity, but asking, for instance, students of color to celebrate diversity within a racist context is actually racist. It's, and so identify the racism, eliminate the racism, identify the ableism, the sexism, the heterosexism, the economic injustice. The second question is, do I have the will to be that threat? Because I know a lot of people working in schools who have the knowledge and skills, but who don't have the will. Now, one thing I want to differentiate here that I'm very conscious of is that it's in some ways it's kind of easy for me as a white guy standing up here saying, you got to have the will. Because I know that I'm not punished the same way that people of color who say that have the exact same message I have are punished for bringing the things up that I bring up. So I feel like the more sort of privileged layers of privileged identity I have, that elevates my need to sort of have that will, because I'm not going to be punished the same way in most institutions that I've been in. Now, the other thing I want to say about this is that this is about a lens. It's not a list of practical strategies. And I think that is, and I think in the previous presentation, sort of that same point was hit on. We get to the practical strategies, but the strategies are no good without the ideological shift. You can't create sustainable equity strategies without the ideological shift. At least that's what I found. Like I've said, that there are no strategies that will turn a teacher who has a deficit view of low-income students or students of color into an effective teacher for those students. Once I have that ideological shift, the strategies are helpful and actually quite natural at that point. So I want to share a couple of stories that kind of got me to this way of thinking. The first one, this is a story from the school I worked with in the northeastern part of the US. And I was doing some focus groups there as part of helping them do like an equity assessment. My first focus group was with a group of African-American students, predominantly white school. And I asked them, so how are things going here for you, around race in the school? I just launched this big diversity initiative, and how's that going? The first student, African-American student who spoke in that focus group, their comment was, I feel like a visitor at my own school. That was their comment. Another student said, I feel hypervisible, but I also feel invisible. So during Black History Month, or when slavery comes up in the curriculum and everyone looks at me, hypervisible. The rest of the time here, I'm pretty invisible. I'm hearing things like this. At the very end of a focus group, a young woman slammed her fist on the table. And she said, there's racism at this school and nobody's doing anything about it. I want you to think about that. The people with the least amount of power in that school, how they're characterizing what the issue is. There's racism here. I feel invisible. I feel like a visitor in my own school. There's racism, no one's doing anything about it. So very next focus group is with upper level administrators, same school. I asked them, how are things going here? How's the diversity initiative? The principal was wearing that tie. Well-meaning dude, I think, former diplomat. He had, you go into his office, the first thing you see is his little, unity through diversity poster, so safe space sticker on the door. I always tell schools, if you actually have to have people putting safe space stickers on their doors to mark the couple of safe spaces in the school, you got a problem there. Some people will look at that, and don't get me wrong, I think teachers in schools that are hostile who are doing that, I think they're brave and awesome for doing that. But principals will often say things to me like, well, we have a few teachers who have those safe space stickers. It's like, oh, so those students have 3 classrooms they can go to in the entire school. How equitable of you. So anyway, so the principal is wearing this tie, and I'm pretty sure he wants that in the assessment report, right? Like, what's going well at the school? Well, the principal wears a diversity tie. So that's, if that's on your list of things going well, you got some work to do at your school. So I asked the question, and the principal leans back, and what he says is, what we need to do here is celebrate the joys of diversity. And my response was, that's your gap. You need to stop talking about this achievement gap. You need to talk about your ideology gap. Because I just came from a focus group of African-American students, and what they said was they're experiencing racism in your school, and you aren't doing anything about it. You're talking about the International Food Fair and the Multicultural Parade. They're talking about experiencing racism, and you're not doing anything about it. To me, that was the gap. There were no amount of strategies they could come up with to create more equity at that school if they weren't going to examine that gap in perceptions about what the problem was that needed to be fixed. I was at a middle school in Minnesota doing some workshops, and I had a group of students come to me and talk about this event that they were going to have. It's called Diverse Friends Day. In essence, this was like mix it up at lunch day, if any of you know that. But basically what was going to happen is for one day, the school was going to forcibly integrate the cafeteria. So you have to sit with people you wouldn't normally sit with. So I asked the students, well, what do you think about the Diverse Friends Day coming up? And the first student said, well, they're going to, these were 2 African-American students and 1 Latino young man. And one of the students said, well, they're going to force us to sit with the kids who don't like us. So one of the students said. Another student said, sort of talked about how lunch was kind of the one time I get to sit with my friends, because most of those students were like the one of, the only of within their class, like I'm the one African-American in Wisconsin. But then the third student said, I think Diverse Friends Day is for white people. And I had to tell you, out of everything I've ever heard anyone say in a school where I was doing work, that was the most insightful thing I ever heard anyone say. Because Diverse Friends Day is for white people. Those 3 students did not need to sit with white students during lunch to learn about race in their school or how racism was operating. They had to know, they needed that knowledge just to survive being in that school. So what was going to happen was, the school's not addressing the racial inequity those students are experiencing, but cajoling those students anyway into participating into this diversity spectacle, right? So these are the things. I also wanted to give one higher ed example. When I was leaving, I taught at this school called Hamline University, and the provost, when I was leaving, asked to talk to me. And he said, I really appreciate all the social justice work you did on campus. And he said, I know we have a lot of work to do, but what is one thing we should really focus on? And because I had just sort of gone to his office, I noticed that his office was not accessible. If anyone had any kind of mobility challenge, they would not be able to get to this guy's office. So my thought, so I'm thinking of all kinds of things, but the thing that I say in that moment was, I think the first thing you need to do is make the campus accessible. Because some people can't even get here long enough to experience the racism they're going to experience here because they can't even access the campus. And so the provost thinks for a second and he says, you know, I hear what you're saying. And then this is what he says. He says, I hear what you're saying, but I can't think of one student who uses a wheelchair on this campus. He says, I don't think that would be a very good investment because I can't even think of one student who even uses a wheelchair on campus. I'm like, well, why do you think there are no students who come to this school? And the thing that I want to point out in all three of these cases, these were educational leaders or schools that were doing things around diversity. They were doing things, they had the optics, they could point to things that they were doing. But they were doing it through an ideology that ensured they were not going to make progress on this. And so much of the effort, I would estimate, in most schools and districts that I'm familiar with, that is probably 80% of the stuff that goes into working on diversity and equity stuff in school. One of the challenges that I see, one of the sort of blocks, I call it the cult of culture, is that and Gloria Ladson-Billings wrote this really brilliant article that she titled the article, "It's not the culture of poverty, it's the poverty of culture." And she's written some other articles about this same thing too. And what she says is that we've become so obsessed with vague notions of culture in education that we talk about culture instead of talking about race. Or we talk about culture instead of talking about heterosexism or class inequities or, you know, or transphobia or whatever it is. It's culture, culture, culture. And you can see that a lot of the popular frameworks for talking about this stuff are based around cultural language. Now, some of them, like Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally responsive stuff, is actually grounded in a racial justice perspective. But what she writes is that I created this model around a racial justice perspective, but when it's implemented in schools, that part is usually stripped away and we're left with cultural competence. I think that's the problem. The one that's most confounding to me is this one, CLD. Has anyone ever heard this term, culturally and linguistically diverse? Do you see how that is empty language? That doesn't mean anything. This describes everyone, culturally and linguistically diverse. And this is why I think language is important, because I think this allows us to detour around the conversation. If we're talking about students who are culturally and linguistically marginalized, then let's say what we're talking about so we can address that. Like, how many of you have ever heard somebody say the diverse students or the multicultural students? The same sort of things happen in there, I think. In higher ed, the term like that is inclusive excellence. Have y'all ever heard that term, inclusive excellence? That's like the big thing. It's like, let's take the two vaguest terms in the entire education lexicon and just smush them together, and nobody will know what in the world we're talking about. So, what am I doing on time? I feel like I'm way behind right now. I have 20 minutes? Okay. Then I will talk more slowly. I don't know why I'm talking so fast. But all of this to say that to me the biggest problem is ideological, and I think part of the problem in schools is that we fall in love with the shiny new things, the grit and the growth mindset and the trauma-informed. Now, as a kid who went to school as someone who had experienced a lot of trauma, I experienced sexual abuse as a kid and other abuse from my father and all this sort of thing. I'm actually thrilled that people are talking about trauma-informed practices in school. I don't have an issue with that. I have an issue with doing that as our equity strategy. And that's how we're doing that in a way that's targeted at students of color, because the racist presumption is, well, if they are students of color, they must be experiencing all kinds of trauma at home. Or if they're low-income students, there must be all this abuse at home. That's my problem with it. Trauma-informed practices. I practice a lot of mindfulness myself. I'm glad we're talking about that in education. But what students who are being marginalized right now need is not mindfulness. They need justice. And that's the part that ends up getting lost because we're so obsessed with trying to fix their mindsets and trying to fix their level of grittiness and trying to fix their social, emotional, whatever, you know. Kind of worked up. All right. So one way, so I have this way that I think about when I work with schools, I talk about equity. I don't think this is the only way to think about it. And this is kind of a stripped down kind of way of thinking about it. But it's really helped me in a way sort of help institutions focus on these matters of like, you know, how is racism operating here and how do you address the racism? So I think of inequity as an unfair or, you know, unjust distribution of access and opportunity. But the important part about this, because that's nothing new from anyone who's ever talked about this, but I think about it both in terms of material access, but also non-material access. So material access would be things like things that cost money, and if I can afford those things or my family can afford it, I might do better in school, like access to tutors, access to a computer in my bedroom, you know, that sort of thing. But there's also non-material access, and those are the things that are a little more insidious. So like I would ask a question like this. The most basic thing that should be fairly distributed in schools, effective teaching. Is effective teaching, does everyone have access to effective teaching in schools, or can we predict who's going to have access to that and who's not going to have access to this? Well, in any schools that are doing any kind of tracking, then chances are we can predict, because we can predict how students are tracked in the race and class and language and other dynamics that go into that. And we also know, based on a lot of research, that just not in every school, but disproportionately, kids who are assigned to higher tracks get more engaging teaching and pedagogy, and the ones who are assigned to lower tracks get more rote regurgitation, boring teaching, and that sort of thing. That we also know that who's most likely to be sent to those lower track classes. What's interesting now is we have the evidence right now where there is no justification for doing any more tracking. The only justification people were desperately holding on to was the notion that the highest achievers needed an opportunity to be with the other highest achievers. But the research that's coming out now is saying that it has no negative impact on the highest achievers when they are put into mixed ability groups. It has no impact on their achievement. So at this point, there is no more justification. We should have stopped doing this a long time ago, because of all the racism and class inequity that feeds into that system. Non-material resources. Do I have access to a school whose policy is built around my lived reality instead of someone else's lived reality? Did any of you go to schools that ever used after-school suspension as a punishment? And think about after-school suspension is a punishment that has a harsher impact on lower income families than it has on other families. Right? A same result of a behavior can actually have a harsher impact for some families than other families. And there's all kinds of other examples. Natural hair policies, right? Dress code policies always seem to be raced and gendered very clearly if you look at them closely. So equity is about redistributing access and opportunity. That doesn't mean we confiscate everyone's backpacks when they come to school and redistribute their stuff. What it does mean is that we actually prioritize the interests of the most marginalized students. The problem with equality is that if some people are starting with this level of access and some are starting with that level of access, and we give them equality, just reproduces this. Equity is about addressing the gap, the disparity in access. And the only way to do that, at least initially, is to actually prioritize access to people here. So when you're in a school or a district that says, well, we're going to start using this online portal to communicate with parents, you might say, well, that's going to give a good chunk of people more access. But which people is that going to result in more access for? It's going to result in more access for the people who already have the most access. The people who have the least access, that's actually going to inhibit their access. If I don't have access to a computer or the internet, then I'm not going to be able to participate in this. So how do we make a decision instead of one that will benefit the biggest number of people to decisions that are actually going to prioritize the interests of the most marginalized people? That's how you make an institution more equitable and just. I'm going to talk more about this in the follow-up activity, but I think about how do we cultivate that, that sort of understanding in ourselves and in educators. So I work with schools around cultivating these 4 abilities. One is just the ability to recognize inequity. I think a lot of people just don't even recognize it. And I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. Then the ability to respond to inequity. When I see it, can I adjust what I'm doing? Can I help someone else adjust what they're doing? Well, am I able to name it in an effective way? Redress is a more structural level. So respond is like this reactive thing that schools do. Like in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Baraboo, Wisconsin. Does anyone know what Baraboo, Wisconsin is famous for now? Anybody see that photograph of the high school students doing the Nazi salutes? Big group of students. Oh, we feel sorry for you having to go there. But, so they did what a lot of districts do. There's something that happens, and they pretend it's an isolated event, and we're just going to respond to that event. And so my question is, well, what is it about the institutional culture here and all of that history that sort of led up to this happening? It's never an isolated event. It might be a temporary escalation, but it's never an isolated event. So redress is being able to take a step back and see the pattern of the network of inequities and injustice. You got one thing going on in your school that is humiliating students experiencing poverty for their poverty, chances are you've got a whole network of those things happening. So just responding to one is not, you gotta maybe learn something from dealing with one and then apply that to all of the policy and practice. And then the last is is the ability to sustain equity efforts in the face of resistance and blowback. And I tell schools, if you're not getting any resistance or blowback, then you actually aren't probably making much progress. Because when you start making progress, that's when you have started redistributing the access and the opportunity. When you started redistributing the access and the opportunity, the families that had a sense of entitlement to having more access and opportunity than the other families, they're going to start complaining, right? So so leaders actually have to see that as a sign that we're moving in the right direction. Well, what a lot of leaders do, I was working with a middle school where there were 3 students who went to their principal and said, we want to start a gay-straight alliance. And the principal said, great, go start the gay-straight alliance. So they went and did that. And then like a month later, the principal goes to the students and says, I'm a little worried the gay-straight alliance is too exclusive. So what I would like to do is turn this into a diversity club. And then anyone will feel like they can come to the diversity club. So the students told me this story. So I go to the principal and I'm like, what in the heck happened? And the principal said, yeah, that's kind of what happened. So I said, well, why did you do that? And what I learned, you know what it took? It took 2 phone calls from parents. 2 parents called that principal and said, I don't want my kids at a school with the Gay Street Alliance. 2 calls from parents. And what did the principal do? The principal prioritized the homophobia of those parents over what, and let's not get this confused. Students starting a Gay Straight Alliance is not a huge step forward. The fact that they needed to create their own little safe space in that school, right? That's not like huge progress. It was a little bit of something. And the students starting it themselves. And all it took was 2 calls. That's the sort of thing, that we have to address is that, anyway, so because I think, when you look at that list, if I can't recognize the inequity, I can't respond to the inequity. If I can't recognize the inequity, I can't find the bigger conditions. So a lot of the work I do is really about learning how to recognize, and we're gonna, in my next piece, the other workshop, we're actually gonna practice this. But I'll just give you one quick example of this. How many of you How many of you, other than that, the top example there, how many of you know about the research that shows how teachers tend to treat boys and girls differently, or at least students are interpreting as boys and girls differently in the classroom? How many of you are familiar with any of that? Y'all know teachers call on boys more than they call on girls, all of that sort of thing. There's this other set of research about how teachers compliment students. And basically what it finds is when they're complimenting boys or young men or students they're interpreting as boys or young men, they're most likely to compliment them on something about their intelligence. You're a great speller. Good job on that test. Sort of. When they compliment young women, what do you think they're most likely to compliment them on? Their appearance. Their appearance. So on average, the compliments that boys or young men hear in school is, you're smart. On average, what young women are hearing is, well, don't you look pretty today? Oh, I like the way you did your hair. Are those new shoes? And what's really interesting about this too is I think most men who are teachers are very cautious not to comment on young women's appearance. Most of this is actually coming from women teachers to young women students. So here's my question to you. Let's say you were observing somebody teaching. Let's say you were sitting observing somebody teaching for a week and they were doing that. Is that something you would notice? I mean, now you would notice it because we're just talking about it. But is that before we talked about it, would you have noticed that, or is that so normalized? I'll ask you this a different way. If you've spent any time in schools, have you noticed that? Because if you haven't noticed it, what that means is you wouldn't have noticed it. Because that means you've been in institutions where that's happening around you all the time. So if you've never noticed that, what that means is you actually have to learn how to notice that. You have to practice learning how to see it. And that's a little micro example, but there are bigger macro examples. Can you recognize a policy that actually privileges wealthier students compared to lower income students? Would you know how to recognize that if you saw it? It's that sort of thing. I do some of the research I'm doing right now is on student families experiencing poverty and little micro humiliations they experience with the school district. And two of the things that come up over and over are the Scholastic Book Fair and these like chocolate bar fundraisers, where students are put in a competition with each other to sell the most, I don't know, bad chocolate or ugly candles. I don't know what do kids around here sell? Chocolate. I was doing a workshop for some superintendents in Pennsylvania, and one of them was talking about they had this chocolate bar fundraiser, and whoever sold the most chocolate got this trip to Hershey Park. It's like, oh, good, they can go celebrate child slavery. That is not a strategic thing to say in a workshop with superintendents from Pennsylvania who seem to love Hershey Park. You can celebrate bad chocolate and child slavery that went into making the bad chocolate. Congratulations. So and I think this sort of connects with what you were saying earlier, and this is again what I'm working on. If we start with racism and we throw in some celebrating diversity, low cultural competence, maybe a little bit of multicultural curricula, we still end up with racism. Because all of that has a role, but none of that identifies and eliminates racism, right? So that's what I'm pushing. How do we keep that at the center of the conversation? Okay, I know I'm not going to have time to go through all these concepts. Whatever I don't go through now, I'll go through later this afternoon. So 3 concepts that I think can be really helpful just in measuring our own sort of tool belt around this sort of thing is equity ideologies, interest convergence, and the relationship between mitigative and transformative change. And I want to go and together we've talked a lot about ideology, but I want to give one more example like at an institutional level. Does this surprise anyone that a U.S. Department of Education study found that Black students were disciplined at far higher rates than white students? Does that shock anyone? We all know that to be true, right? African American students are suspended or expelled at higher rates than white students, right? We know that to be true. The question is why? That's the question that schools often skip. Now, if I'm starting with a sort of deficit view of African American people, like I think it's their fault, then I look at this and what is my explanation for that?
They behave like
And the dominant view of teachers in the US is that view. The dominant view of US teachers, I've studied this specifically around poverty, a little bit less around race, but the dominant view is this deficit view. The dominant view is, of course, they're suspended and expelled more. They misbehave more. But the research completely contradicts that. The research says that this happens basically for two reasons, both having to do with racial ideologies and racist ideologies in teachers. The first is that, on average, teachers interpret the behavior of African-American students and Latinx students, by the way, more harshly than they interpret the behavior of white students. Okay, so that's number one. Same behavior interpreted more harshly. Secondly, if I'm a white teacher, let's say I'm a white teacher and there's an African-American student who's coming to class late, that at a sort of a psychosocial implicit level, that commonly white teachers attribute that behavior to the student's race. If I have a white student coming in late, I would never be like, oh, these white people are always late, right? So what ends up happening is both I have sort of a harsher interpretation of the behavior, and on top of that, that African-American students are held accountable to the accumulative behaviors of African-American students, because the behaviors are being attributed to the race. You see what's happening there? That's the primary explanation of why this is happening. A lot of schools are trying to address this as a problem, and virtually none of them are addressing that. Mostly what they're trying to do is implementing behavior strategies, implementing mindfulness strategies, implementing restorative justice strategies. Some of these can be good strategies. What most of them are not doing is rooting the racism out of the teachers, right? Which is the only way to solve this as a problem. We're not talking about all teachers. In fact, what a lot of the research shows is that in some schools, there's a small number of white teachers who are doing the majority of this. And then white teachers more generally are doing a little bit of it, but a lot of this can be tracked, a lot of it can be tracked to a small number of white teachers. So some of the research about this shows that there are basically three ideological positions that teachers embrace when it comes to understanding those kinds of disparities. The first one is deficit ideology. Deficit ideology means that I don't acknowledge at all any sort of structural barriers or conditions, that I identify the source of the problem within the marginalized group. We have to fix students of color. We have to fix low-income students. We have to fix English language learners. We have to help them care more about their kids' education. We need to help them be more gritty. We need to give them a growth mindset. That's the sort of thing that is most common. Generally, as I've said and written a million times, people in the equity work see someone named Ruby Payne as the primary purveyor of deficit ideology, that her work is really grounded in that. And it's some of the most popular work being used in schools right now. The second ideological position is called grit ideology. Grit ideology, we might recognize that there is racism and economic injustice, but instead of addressing those barriers, we focus on grit and resilience strategies. I want you to have the grit and resilience to overcome the racism you're experiencing in the school that I'm looking at right now. That's sort of a lot of, now again, all things being equal, we're working on racial justice in the school. If we're doing that, I don't really mind having a resiliency initiative as long as it's a broad initiative and not, this is our equity strategy, or the way we're gonna close the achievement gap is by giving students, I mean, think about it. I'm experiencing racism out of school and in school. I'm going into these classrooms with teachers who have racial bias, many of whom don't even know they have racial bias. And somehow I'm surviving that and I'm in school, and you think I need more resilience. You know, or I'm a low-income student, I don't have enough to eat, I don't have good health care. I'm working after school and taking care of younger siblings, and you think what I need is grit? I'm already the most resilient person in this school. That's the backward thinking that happens. So what we want is what I call structural ideology. Structural ideology, identify the barrier, eliminate the barrier. Identify the inequity, eliminate the inequity, identify the racism, identify the racist policies and practices, eliminate those, replace them with equitable and just policies and practices. Okay, I think I've hit my 45 minutes, but I'll just close. So the stuff I didn't get to, I will get to in my next session. But I'll close just with a really quick thing. Should have had this pulled up already. Just as a way for you to practice recognizing deficit ideology. Have any of you ever seen this before? Test your knowledge of the hidden rules of class. This comes from the person I mentioned earlier called Ruby Payne. This is used to train for a lot of trainings in schools. And what you see is that she has these 3 checklists. Could you survive in poverty? Could you survive in middle class? And could you survive in wealth? Now, without even looking at that checklist, raise your hand if you think you could survive in wealth. Give us a little time to adjust. We'll probably do it. But here's the manipulation I want. The first manipulation here, and this is that cultural competence manipulation. The first manipulation is this sense that, well, there are just these 3 cultural groups. If we just understand them as 3 cultural groups, then we can teach better. Actually, that's not what's happening. These are 3 groups with vastly different access and opportunity, who are treated vastly differently by schools and school districts. These are differences in power, and that's what things like cultural competence mask if we don't match them with something more like racial justice. The other thing is, if you look at this, could you survive in poverty? Do you see anything on that list that might actually contribute to stereotypes about people experiencing poverty? How about, I know how to bail someone out of jail? That one? I know how to get a gun even if I have a police record. Now, here's the other manipulation. Here's the other manipulation. The other manipulation is that in the US, wealthy people are just as likely to have committed crimes as people in poverty. We know that as a fact. We know that even from self-report research, where wealthy people have to admit their own crimes for us to do that. The problem is the valuing that happens, because that's really present on the poverty list, but I don't see that somehow on the wealthy list. And I always say, like, they accidentally left a space, so we could add, like, I know how to hire high-priced prostitutes discreetly. We could just add, like, I know how to avoid paying federal taxes. We could put, but you would never see that. You would never see that. In the same way, you would never see a chapter on what needs to be fixed about the mindsets of white people so they can score better on achievement tests. We see that all the time with African American people, Latinx people, and so on. So I'm gonna, what I want to challenge you all to think about doing is continuing to work on how to recognize how that stuff is operating in schools. It's not enough just to have some diversity and equity strategies. The question is, are they strategies that are really going to be a threat to the inequity, or are they strategies that are going to contribute to the inequity? So, thank you.
Why don't we get both you guys up? I'm here to sort of just pick out folks who have questions and let them respond. So I know folks either might have to go to teach or go to the class or something. So if you want to step out, whatever, that's fine. Questions, thoughts?
Okay, I'll start. So my question is, so in that scenario that you gave us with the principal who had parents calling about, you know, the school making that club for our safe space, how do you then counsel a principal in dealing with parents who do give pushback?
For that particular principal, my main strategy was public shaming. No, I'm just kidding. I actually, in some districts, have done workshops specifically on how do you sort of manage that. And there's a couple things. One is to give strategies. Like it's important to never be defensive about it. Okay. And also that, you have to have, unless you're used to dealing with it, you have to have like a statement in your mind that you could say. And always say, you thank them for their feedback. I really appreciate you taking the time to give the call. to give us a call. But, within our, within our mission statement, what we think is really important is that students who want to start these initiatives around equity are empowered to do it. And so we're going to continue to support this, but I appreciate your feedback. That's not, but the other thing that I talked to them about is there's this research that when leaders, not just in schools, but in other contexts, do unpopular things, usually their perception is the complaints are going to last for 10 years. But, talk to any school district who finally changed a racist sports mascot, and usually the life of the complaints are about 6 months. After about 6 months, parents find something else to complain about. So if you can withstand it for 6 months, and that's why a lot of change doesn't happen, because people are worried about the onslaught. I think it's going to go forever. So also just talking them down a little bit, helps.
Thank you both for being here today. So I had a quick question. Covington High School students, recently in the news, the incident happened, and a lot of people, I've been reading a lot of commentary, and their proposal was have the high school students go to a community of color to learn, communities of color to learn about diversity and inclusion, which I'm totally against because people of color are not petting zoos. So I was wondering, in this fight for diversity and inclusion, I look at school districts who bring students of color to predominantly white institutions to be these cultural representations. So I just quickly wanted to know your commentary as, as an institution, how do we go about changing that dynamic of equity and access and opportunity without having to remove students of color from their safe place? Anyone.
I'm just, nothing specific is coming to mind right now, but I sort of go back to if we turn institutions into places that will be safe spaces. The problem is that's the step that always gets skipped. So I think about importing students of color into that Covington High School. When you were saying that, the thing that I thought about, did y'all see this YouTube video of, it was like a coach or something doing the walk the line activity with a group of high school students? Did y'all see that? And he said, I have a $100 bill, and whoever wins the race gets $100. Did anybody see that?
Yeah.
It's this classic example of using students of color as props for very gentle diversity learning for white students. And my work is always about that's not their role. And if you want to increase, and even if you did have more students of color there, it's still not their responsibility to confront the racism of other people at the institution. So to me, that's leadership's responsibility to cultivate an institutional culture.
I think in teacher education, we do that a lot as well. In our classes, I think, and it's something that I've been really conscious of moving away from in my early years. I know I like most teacher educators, would do the privilege lineup, or the white as strategies to teach white people around racial privilege often are racially hostile to students of color, right? That white people are going to learn because they got up to the front of the line that, oh, I have all these privileges. That is helpful for white people. That's not helpful for people of color who already know that and now have white people turning around to look at you, right? So I think a lot of the ways that we teach, a lot of the ways that we work around racial justice in teacher education are racist and perpetuate racism. So that's a real dilemma and a challenge when the majority of our students are white students who are going to be teaching students of color, and how do you increase their awareness and address their racial ideology in ways that aren't hostile and harmful for students of color who are also in those classes. Some of the things we've been doing now is having racial affinity groups. So I've been running with my white students what we have been like casually calling the White Girl Book Club, but we've been reading White Fragility, working on using this really wonderful book by a woman named Layla Saeed around white supremacy and me that kind of breaks down ways that white people perpetuate white supremacy in a space where people of color don't have to hear us working through those concepts, because you shouldn't have to hear that as we're working through it, right? But we still need a place to work through that, right? So having spaces like that, having spaces for teachers of color to work through some issues around race as well, internalized racism, issues that people of color, like, they don't need me to be facilitating that group, right? So, you know, I work very closely with a Black teacher educator at my school. She works often with Black students and students of color around some of these issues, and I work with the white students. So I don't know if that's getting to your question, but it's sort of the higher ed version of what you're getting at. And I agree that, you know, I saw that petting zoo tweet too, like, that's just not the right strategy. And I think, you know, it raises issues around that strategy in general when we're talking about detracking and desegregation, and all of those are not so that we can be sitting next to each other because isn't that nice? It's so that resources, both material and non-material, are equitably distributed.
I just, we were talking about the parents calling in, it just reminded me of an event that we, I used to work with the Basic Dreamers, and we would go to the high schools, and it was like an underground network where we would get emails from the counselors, and we'd go to the school and talk to the small group of students. And the teachers there, I don't know specifically who it was, but they suggested that we don't advertise to the school, to those other students, that we kept it like a network, underground network. And I didn't understand why. I understood that the other parents would be happy about that, about them helping those off-with the students. So that really bothered me. But also in terms of the students going to the high schools and spending all their time, like, and their time that they should be spending schoolwork and PTA, hopefully, I don't know, and the school just depending on them to do that work instead of providing those resources for their students. Is there any suggestions for how to get the schools to do these resources and not relying on the students?
Can you ask your question again? I just want to make sure I got it.
Yeah, how do you reach out to these families and offer them these services of in terms of like the legal services or resources available to their children if they are undocumented, but also how do you get the school itself to do this work rather than relying on an outside source of students? Or do you guys do any of that? Have you seen that?
Well, I mean, I was, up until last May, I was at George Mason for 10 years, so I saw that stuff operating, and I've done some work with Jim Krewalker, I think was really involved in that too. I think it's harder, in some ways I feel like it's harder in higher ed, because I think administrators are more insulated in higher ed behind layers and layers of other people. And so they could keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, like every social justice thing that happens at George Mason. I think at the K-12 level, I don't know if I have a specific thought about like that specific thing, but it depends on, I think the strategy depends on what the resistance is around. Is the resistance political? Like, I don't want to do that because I don't buy into it politically. Is the resistance, I don't want to deal with the blowback? Is the resistance, I didn't even really think of this as a problem. Depending on, identifying what the holdup is, I think is important. And then come up with a strategy to target what the problem is. So that might be leadership development, but it might be organizing to put pressure on the leader.
Pressure on change?
I think I actually do think that there is a place for that. That there's a place for public shaming to name what a school is or isn't doing. I don't necessarily think that it should be the first strategy, but if no one responds to the first strategy, then I think that's fair play.
One thing I want to respond, just sort of jump in, and so undocumented students also, in the current regime, public efforts to undertake assistance can accumulate records that other agencies can gain access to. And so that exposes those students to other kind of vulnerabilities as well. Private organizations don't necessarily have that same obligation to share that information. So I understand, it is on organizations, or it is on schools to sort of assume this is part of their mission. At the same time, there may be a set of strategic concerns to be aware that that may expose students to other vulnerabilities that they wouldn't have if other actors are able to do the work. And the work has to be done, and it's a question of how do we not inadvertently create additional injustices and barriers. So, are there anyone besides Jessica at this point?
I have one.
That's okay. That's great.
I was gonna ask, Dr. Bree, I don't want to mispronounce
That's
your last name. I know you talked a lot about changing the ideologies of a lot of white practitioners, but do you know of any initiatives to increasing teachers of color, or at least having their voice be more heard within educational space?
Absolutely. So one that I would recommend off the bat is called the Institute for Teachers of Color. It's a summer institute that's run by a colleague in California, Rita Coley. And it's I think it's a 4-day institute for teachers of color who have racial justice understandings already. So one of the reasons she started this was that she found that, one, having spaces that included white people really ended up tailoring to the needs of white teachers. And that when it was teachers of color, it would tailor itself to the teachers of color who were exhibiting more white supremacist ideas, right? Teachers of colors who were saying who were holding deficit ideas, who were, talking about grit, who didn't necessarily have racial consciousness or critical consciousness around race. And so it left a void for critically conscious teachers of color to find spaces with like-minded people to build from where they are. So she started that institute that runs each summer in California. So I think that's an important one. And then different cities have different, there's a network of teacher activist groups across the country. I was involved with one in New York called NICOR, and they have racial affinity groups. So looking for different teacher activist groups and different racial affinity groups. There's also an institute, or it's really a workshop put on by an organization called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They do workshops called Undoing Racism. And typically after they do them, they try to create networks of racial affinity groups. And so contacting them in different cities might provide access to different affinity groups where they have a presence. Because I know there's one in New Jersey, there's one in New York.
There's a newer one, I think, in DC that is sponsored by Teaching for Change. One of those networks too. Did I score her name?
Yeah.
And I guess just thinking about, you kind of spoke about the low quality of most teacher preparation programs. And I'm wondering if you know any of either initiative or movement to kind of bring those teacher preparation programs that are, quality programs to scale, since we know that it's like a national issue.
Yeah. It's funny that you said that because my colleague and I were just talking about that the other day. Like we were just talking about trying to think across the country, which are the programs that we know are doing, that are addressing racial justice within teacher education programs. And we were like, we need a network for those. We're like, okay, we need to get ourselves get this next grant, get ourselves established, and then we need to try and figure out this network of who, because it's happening in pockets.
Right.
And one of the issues is, I know for myself, when I was just teaching, it was frustrating because I felt like I was addressing these issues in my classes, but then my students were going to all these other classes where, no one was talking about issues of race or equity, gender, anything. Now that I am in a position of leadership in the programs and I can have a role in who's teaching and other things, I feel like now finally I'm able to feel like my students are getting a more holistic preparation. But it's really about, there are professors across the country who are doing this work, but are there programs doing this work?
Maybe writing me to the grant.
You got it. If you come to Jersey, we got it. We got you.
I think that, like, to emphasize as well, the same thing for me was that I often felt as a teacher educator like I was teaching against the things students were learning in the other classes, and that's tough. And I think a lot what's happening more than, like the two programs are doing a really good job emphasizing this across the program in the country, is that in most programs I know of, there's one or two people who might be in a faculty of 10 who are pushing the boulder uphill within their program. So I love this idea of networking the programs that are doing well, but also networking the people who are getting exhausted. There's a lot of burnout and a lot of people leaving just because how much resistance there is.
Maybe a comment also the requirements to become a teacher, because we can do a lot of change in our classes and maybe have our colleagues are not doing the same, but if a teacher can become a teacher without that idea of social justice or a requirement, I don't know how we could test that out or something, then what will never change that much. I see that with languages in Virginia, when the level required to become a language teacher is so low, but I can imagine with other things it's the same, that the most educators are not so engaged in this type of discourse and action. So we also need to lobby at the Commonwealth in Virginia or here, because almost everybody can become a teacher. And I'm not.
I was doing a workshop for this district in New Jersey, and workshop. I was doing some consulting around how to identify equity-minded teachers there. And as like a first step, I told them just add one question to your interview process. And the question I suggest is, there's like 20% African-American students in this district. It's the biggest group of color in the district. I just ask a question: why, on average, do African-American students not do as well in school as white students? Some do better, but on average, right? And I said, if their response is attributing it to the students, they don't care about education, they don't have any role models, then that person should not be put, and really shouldn't be put in a classroom until they get that worked out. And they did that, and and they're interviewing every year. They're interviewing hundreds of candidates, and a little bit more than half of the people that they interviewed were coming in with this deficit.
Yeah, and even worse than we let anyone with mindsets in, it's all the gatekeeping that are keeping people who are equity-minded out, right? Keeping all the praxis, the GPA requirements, all of the things that are keeping teachers of color out of the profession. My program is, explicitly aimed at bringing justice-minded teachers to Newark. We are a team. I'm the only person on the team who isn't a person of color. We are all committed to bringing in as many teachers of color into the program as we can. And we, despite all of that, we have a grant, we have the will, we have everything lined up to do it. We lost one Black woman to praxis. We lost an amazing young African American man to the GPA requirement. We almost lost an incredible Haitian woman who was working on her documentation because of the legal costs of getting her citizenship. We almost lost her, but luckily we were able to find funding. Like, it's the racism, right? So, we talk about, okay, we need to diversify the teaching force. How can we bring more teachers of color in? We can find you, we've got you, and yet, despite all of our efforts, it's these broader issues. And so some of my colleagues on my team and I are writing this piece about, we can't have these conversations about diversifying the teaching force and tinkering with the pipeline without addressing the toxicity in which these pipelines lay, which is racism and capitalism. And if we're not going to address those issues, it doesn't matter if we have this grant and we have a team of women of color and we have, placements that we have everything lined up, and yet we couldn't make it happen for the majority of our students of color in the program.
Yeah, they said you can't even control, if they get through your program and get into a school, the racism they might experience at that school. So
Absolutely.
teachers of color leave more quickly than white teachers on average, and part of that is, being a teacher of color at school feels a lot like being a student of color.
Right.
That's going experiencing the same stuff. So.
Dominated.
Sorry.
Sorry. Dr. Gorski, we read your book and we are fans of,
Signing like.
Yes.
I feel like I should apologize. I think this raises a question about the quality of your program.
So it's great. We may need to take a picture. But so you touched on trauma-informed practices, which I think, is great. But I do have a question on, as educators who know that students, and including us, educators of color, students of color are experiencing something that I recently learned is vicarious trauma. So if you don't know what that is, Black Lives Matter, for example, seeing, police brutality play out kind of thing, and it does impact us. However, how do we help our students process that without making that the focal point of their learning experience? Especially for non-teachers of color, when they're coming into the classroom and these things are happening to your students. And some people don't feel like they have a place to talk about that, but we do have to have that safe space to help our students process, what's going on without, victimizing them all over again or anything like that. So how do we do that without making them feel horrible?
I feel like I should give that question because she's actually done research about teacher activists. So you might be in a better position to answer that than me.
Nicely played. I think that you answered your question with your question. I think that a lot of the work that is coming out of trauma-informed teaching is how you do a lot of this, and it's also in the relationships that you build with your students to know when it's the time to keep going with this conversation and when it's time to back off, and just even having the questioning stance that you have around, I know that, there is no easy answer. It's a dilemma. I know I need to create the space for them to have these conversations. And how do I do that without re-traumatizing them? That is the question. So there isn't really an easy answer around that. I think one of the things that helps is having teacher ally colleagues as a space for you to process how you're doing it, how you're handling it, how are you absorbing the trauma of your students as they're sharing their stories and their experiences that are challenging to hear. And maybe, as you're saying, there's also the secondary trauma of hearing your students' trauma and it triggering your own, like having people to process that with, as opposed to carrying that by yourself, I have another colleague also in California, named Bree Khorshid, and she runs a group called HELA, which stands for Healing, Education, Liberation. Can't remember the LA. But it's worth looking up, and she's written about this. And so it's another group of, I think Jessica, you had asked also, it's another group of teachers of color, and she's written about how that group is structured and the support that they've provided for each other to be able to survive and thrive in doing this kind of very, very emotional work.
Sure, they may come in, storm in, because we don't get the room till 2, but go ahead.
This is snapped to me, which I think is really important to trauma-informed practice. So I think, one of the things I see a lot is that teachers who aren't trained at engaging students in conversations about racism, that students of color are often re-traumatized, because what happens is if there's a few students of color and a lot of white students, mostly what's happening are white supremacist comments. And if a student of color steps up to say something anti-racist, there's a piling on. And unfortunately, most teachers don't teach this the way they would teach biology, where if somebody made a factually incorrect statement, they would not just let that statement lay out there. But in conversations about race, the thing is, well, we just need to let that everything is just an opinion. And so even in conversations about racism, constantly what I see is that students of color are being re-traumatized. And the teachers actually have to be trained to advocate, to stand on the side of students of color during those conversations and not just try to be some objective facilitator. So I think a lot of damage is done when people who aren't trained to do it. And most teachers aren't trained in their teacher ed programs to facilitate those kinds of conversations.
Thank you both. Really wonderful. So for the MAT students, we're going to go back downstairs to the conference room and then the breakout room down there to do the follow-up stuff. And the rest of you, thank you all for coming. We'll see you all at the next event, which I believe is in February. So we'll send out notices.